Hello, everyone. This is Knowledge Sharing in Trauma-Informed Art Therapy, a presentation based on Janina Fisher's The Living Legacy of Trauma. I am your host, Brenda Cleary. Just kidding. I'm going to be walking with you through this presentation that's designed to be in bite-sized chunks, so there's lots of breaks. But we're going to be talking about trauma and trauma as the state of disconnection between self, other, and spirit, and how to reconnect, and the process of that, and the science behind it, and the art of it, of course. So, what are my objectives here? So, who doesn't need an owner-operator's manual for the impact of trauma? And this here in this presentation is a roadmap from the journeys of other people. We have part 1 and part 2. This is part 1, and it's going to focus on how human beings adapt to living in the face of threat long-term, and also give you an orientation to my practice of art therapy. And as always, take what you like and leave the rest. Before we get too much further, I want to acknowledge that trauma is a huge topic. So trauma exists within historical trauma, within political systems of oppression, and these filter into the individual human psyche. So we're going to be focusing more on the individual level, and within the individual trauma healing, we're going to be looking at phase 1, which is safety and stabilization. So the first thing that we need to do before doing any trauma work is we need to look at emotional regulation, and we also need to be more attuned to dissociation when it comes up, and helping a person create bodily safety, create a safe environment, create emotional safety, and develop more here and now capacity, because it's really our adult here and now present self that can process a traumatic event. And yeah, we will get into this a little bit more later in the video, but we'll start here. So I believe that knowledge sharing is critical to good collaboration. And in working together, I want to make sure that you know everything that I know about trauma and how to work with it and how to move forward with your life. This information shouldn't be gatekept. So this is part of honoring the principles of good trauma-informed practice, and also just taking a moment to acknowledge that you may have spent time in therapeutic spaces where these principles weren't in effect. So take a look at this slide. It's where I'm coming from. It's my ethical ground. And I do acknowledge that not all therapeutic spaces have been safe for all people for myriad reasons. This video is in bite-sized chunks. It follows transforming the living legacy of trauma largely, except where I jump in to go off on a tangent about art therapy. Please do pause and take a moment to look at the workbook, because knowledge, to start to have a therapeutic effect, it has to be integrated at an emotional level. So there's regular pauses throughout these slides. So stop, grab the workbook, do some art, take a breather, make yourself a cup of tea, and just pause. In trauma healing, slower is faster. You've pushed yourself enough in life. Take this slow and gentle. So why art therapy? Art is as old as humanity itself, and cultures across the world have been using it in healing traditions long before psychotherapy was invented. And art will put you in touch with your innate healing instincts like nothing else I've seen. I originally trained as a nurse. This gave me great respect for the healing instincts of the body, but art therapy really taught me and showed me that within every single human being, no matter what they have gone through, there is a healing force that is unbreakable and unshakable. And I trust that, and I trust the art to put you in touch with that. And in trauma healing, we're really looking at the goals of restoring a flexible nervous system, dignity, and establishing safe relationships in life. And art will show you how to do that, because art is inherently regulating. It is a suitcase full of activities and approaches and modalities that help us integrate our minds and our hearts and our spirits, and also help us express a truth that is uniquely ours. Okay, so this is a brief overview of what you can expect from an art therapy session, moving from a check-in into art making and then into processing, reflecting, and kind of integrating insight. It's a typical arc that we use, and it's different than talk therapy. So I want you to think about coming into the therapeutic space as an art space. Think about what kind of materials you want to use. Think about what kind of images are arising for you. And this is a dance. Art therapy is client-led, but also I might offer some provocations to kind of start to shake up the thinking process a little bit, shake up the feeling process a little bit, and ignite the creative process that will really guide you through your journey in life at the moment. So art therapy blends top-down and bottom-up processing really fluently. So top-down processing is where we kind of process our lives through our verbal means and focus on spotting cognitive patterns. And bottom-up processing is really taking the knowledge and information that we're getting from the body and bringing it into conscious awareness. Art therapy pivots between both of these approaches and has art in the room as kind of like the third partner at any time. It's pretty cool. So without further ado, let's start looking at the flip chart and let's start understanding the living legacy that traumatic events leave behind in our minds and bodies. So surviving trauma is complicated by the way our minds and bodies respond to overwhelming, threatening events. A traumatic event does not feel over because we are left with a living legacy of responses that reactivate trauma-related responses, feelings, and body memories. Worse yet, the living legacy of trauma consists of an array of symptoms and difficulties not easily recognizable as trauma-related. Each represents a way the body and mind adapted to facing living with daily threats of danger, to being trapped, to being too young or too powerless to leave an abusive or neglectful situation. However, the living legacy doesn't feel like a memory, nor is it experienced as a past event. We don't have these memories the same way we would remember how to go to the grocery store, for instance. It takes knowledge and practice to differentiate a feeling or body memory from a situational reaction to something that's happening in the present moment. If these events felt like a long ago part of the past, survivors would not feel haunted or damaged by them. But because the trauma-related reactions are constantly being triggered and re-evoked by ordinary life, the legacy of trauma is kept alive long after the events are over. So, key points here. After trauma, the body and the brain still respond to the environment as if the danger were still there, stimulating the living legacy and re-evoking the sense of threat. Telling the story doesn't change these responses. And again, that's often the go-to thought about trauma healing, is that if we tell the story, the responses will change. So, but it doesn't work that way. So go ahead and look at this diagram and notice all of the different traumatic effects depicted in the diagram. And just take a moment to see which one is most familiar to you. All of these symptoms are trauma related, and trauma just isn't an impact of violence. It can also be an impact of prolonged neglect. And I want you just to be curious, how did, for instance, the depression help you survive? How did numbing out help you survive? How did losing hope help you survive? And remember, the nervous system chooses for you, right? To keep you safe. The nervous system always says better safe than sorry. And one of the ones that I really want to point out is the sense of shame. Shame is really common as a trauma symptom, because shame is what a person does when they're faced with a situation that's outside of their control, and they can internalize it to feel like, oh, if I had done something different, I would have a different outcome. It's my fault. It's a way of exerting mastery, right? And a lot of traumatic responses are They can be a way of hiding. They can be a way of keeping people at a distance so you can be safe. They can be a way of shutting down to survive, staying small to avoid attack, right? So viewing symptoms in that way starts to really destigmatize things and start to help them make sense from a survival perspective. And this is blocked out through pages about 1 to 20 of the workbook. So just make yourself a cup of tea, turn on some nice music, and hang out and just let that simmer for a while. So now the question is, why do we have a living legacy of trauma instead of a memory of it? This is a simplified model of the brain, but basically we don't just have one brain, we have three very different brains. Each specialized for certain functions and respond to things differently. The reptile brain controls our physiology, heart rate, and breathing, and our instinctive reactions. It has no words or emotions. Babies are born with a very well-developed reptile brain, but their mammalian brain, their limbic system, is just starting to really develop and grow. We'll talk more about that in the second video. The mammalian brain, by contrast, or limbic system, is the emotion brain. It has no words, just feelings. This is where we store emotional memories and attachment experiences without words or pictures. Only the prefrontal cortex, or the thinking brain, which is the newest part of the brain to develop evolutionarily, allows us to put into words what we experience. It helps us reason and plan and learn from the past, and it isn't very emotional. It's logical and very factual. Sometimes when we feel emotional, we can't find the words to convey our experience. Or when we feel an impulse, we can't stop it even if we want to. That's because the thinking brain is inhibited by emotions or impulses. Other times we may be able to think, but not to feel at the same time. So it takes practice and coordination of effort for all three brains to work in harmony. And, so just to recap, the reptilian brain, the lizard brain, it acts instinctively. It doesn't talk to us in words, and words are not understood by it. It does not stop to think. Think reflexes and instinct. Our mammalian brain, or emotional brain, has no words. This is why we can have lots of deep feelings that we can't put into words, especially when the emotions are intense, because it's blocking the prefrontal cortex. Only the thinking brain can use language and logic, but it doesn't usually have much effect, by contrast, on our emotions or impulses. This is why reading books about psychology helps us understand them, but might not help us change. So art therapy, again, it's a nonverbal technique, so it really can go straight into the emotion brain. So this slide starts to talk about how we remember trauma with our feelings and our bodies more than our conscious mind. So many trauma survivors worry that they can't remember what happened to them. They wonder, did I dream this? Did this really happen? Am I lying? Is it real? And having things feel unreal can be a way of coping, and also in line with how we actually remember trauma. Brain scan research has helped us better understand the nature of trauma and why traumatic memories are often missing or fragmented or incoherent. When we're exposed to a threat, a brain structure called the amygdala is stimulated. The amygdala is like the brain's smoke detector and fire alarm. It sets off a series of effects that prepare us to defend ourselves. One of these effects is the shutting down of the prefrontal cortex so that we can act instinctively and quickly to danger. But without the thinking brain, we can't put what happens into words or even into a logical sequence afterwards, and that interferes with remembering it as an event. What we do remember are all the feelings, reactions, and physical responses, but often with no connection to what happened. The three brain regions now contain different types of memories. The reptile brain can remember our instinctive reactions. The mammalian brain retains the feeling and the body memories, and the thinking brain may or may not remember much of it or have trouble putting it into words. And sometimes, as we know, that thinking brain can kind of go on loop and try to resolve that memory by revisiting it when these three parts of the brain aren't in sync. So key points here, we don't remember trauma the way we remember ordinary events. Traumatic memory is quite different. Instead of being stored in the prefrontal cortex as a narrative, the emotional and body memories of trauma are stored in the amygdala as feelings and sensations without words. When we are triggered, the prefrontal cortex shuts down, making it hard to think or talk, and we are flooded with intense emotional and body memories. What happened long ago doesn't feel over because the feeling and the body memories get triggered over and over again. With an inhibited prefrontal cortex, we cannot differentiate past and present very well. And that's really where we start in trauma healing, is kind of making that line more defined. So I hope in the last slide that kind of also helped you understand a little bit about how, if we have a brain that works basically in three parts, our thinking brain can remember story, but not have any emotion attached to it. I think we've heard people tell really dramatic stories without having their emotions connected. And our sensory systems in a flashback can hear images or sounds attached to the event and leave us re-triggered in the present moment based on a sensory association from the past. And our bodies also can have really intense physical sensations sometimes. Remembering impulses and movements like tightening or trembling or sinking that were experienced at that time that we couldn't feel fully because maybe we weren't in our bodies as it was happening. So let's talk a little bit more about triggers and how they work. They're a big buzzword, but it helps to understand them. So triggers support an ongoing sense of threat, and people who have lived through trauma and still carry it live in a high alert state. In prehistoric times, this made a lot of sense because we needed to be sensitive to all the cues and associations that could be connected to a threat. We needed to be hypersensitive to triggers that may have meant the difference between life and death when we had to run around and defend ourselves from saber-toothed tigers. But the modern world is a little bit different. And we still have this innate tendency to react to trauma-related cues, which often activates our survival responses, even when we're not in danger. Whether it's the sound of a door opening, brake squealing, tone of voice, time of day, these situations can all trigger fear, fight, flight, or shame as if the trauma were an immediate threat. So it's kind of hard to put the past behind us when it's constantly being re-evoked by ordinary things in our environment. So triggering is constantly happening because the brain errs on better safe than sorry. It's better to assume danger than to trust safety. I'll talk briefly in another slide about how biochemically we start getting rewired to assume danger rather than safety. It's a big part of anxiety and depression. An individual who's traumatized in the context of family and home is likely to be triggered by those closest to them and by their home, neighborhood, and community. And triggering, it's important to understand, is not connected to any one event or person in your history. Triggers can activate emotional and body memories, not event memories, and they are more often connected to the cumulative impact of traumatic environment rather than to specific experiences. So we're going to start to differentiate triggered feelings that give us information about the past from regular feelings that give us good information about, differentiated triggered feelings that give us information about the past from regular feelings, so we can assess situations more accurately, judge cause and effect, and feel less overreactive. So triggered reactions are sudden, intense, and slow to fade, whereas regular feelings ebb and flow, and they build to a gradual peak, whereas triggered feelings can be quite automatic. It's important to listen differently to regular feelings than to triggered feelings. Triggered feelings, again, tell us about the past, and regular feelings tell us more about the present. So this slide sets us up for deeper conversations in the second video, but living in a state of always being aware of threats and feeling in danger, it floods our mind and our bodies with cortisol. And chronic cortisol exposure can have all kinds of health impacts, And it also really shuts down that prefrontal cortex and it starts to rewire the brain so that it's harder to get the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, online. And it makes the amygdala larger, it makes it grow, it makes it easier to react. So, part of trauma healing is healing the body, being aware of the toxicity of the stress response, and just understanding that if we're healing from trauma, we're going to have to do some work to consciously start to rewire our own minds. So, to resolve traumatic memories, we have to start learning to wake up the flexible thinking brain. Um, It's really crucial for the prefrontal cortex to regain the ability to think and put words to what we are feeling. If the prefrontal cortex is unable to distinguish a triggered sense of danger from a real danger, we're never quite sure we're safe, meaning that our systems are getting flooded with cortisol. Without the frontal cortex, our ability to use words is limited. Our ability to organize, prioritize, make decisions, or remember what happened yesterday is compromised. But the most important reason for reactivating the prefrontal cortex is its reciprocal relationship to the amygdala. Increased activity in the prefrontal cortex is associated with decreased activity in the amygdala and vice versa. The more we are curious, focused, and aware, the calmer our bodies become, and a felt sense that the trauma is over, that we're safe now, is dependent on having a workable prefrontal cortex and a calm body. So, activity key points. Activity in the thinking brain tells the body that we are not in danger anymore, and we can remind ourselves that we're just triggered. So, learning to differentiate triggered emotions from information and feelings about the present moment is critical. We can say to ourselves, this is triggering, I'm just triggering, this is a feeling flashback, not something bad happening right now. The more we can reassure ourselves that we're just triggered, the more likely we can slow the triggering and recover from it. If we respond to triggered feelings as if we're in danger, we become more and more activated and ramp up that feeling. And attempting to analyze or intellectualize a triggering situation requires complex processing that is beyond the scope of a shutdown prefrontal cortex. We just need to be able to observe and notice. Don't have to psychoanalyze it, don't have to unpack it. Just say, the conversation was really triggering, for instance. I'm still shaking a little bit, but it's just triggering. I'm okay. That's all really we have capacity for, and that's all really what's needed. So you might have learned in other psychotherapeutic modalities or seen in the abundance of TikTok videos information about grounding and coping. So one thing that we can do in art therapy is we can make like a getting back to baseline box, because it's really hard to cue skills that we learn to calm ourselves when we're in a triggered state. And it's helpful just to make a box with things that we remember that get us grounded. So contents of the box is divided into things that reflect the brainstem, the limbic system, and prefrontal cortex. So at the brainstem level, we know about breathing exercises. So box breathing is something that you can explore, making something that represents box breath. I've had people make little tablets, little paintings reflecting box breathing, also ice cubes. An incredible thing to do when you're feeling like you're about to spiral is to splash cold water on your face. I mean, really get it all the way up over the forehead and around the ears. That's a way of tricking your body into thinking that it's drowning in cold water, and it cuts the flood of cortisol, and it'll bring down your heart rate to about half of what it was, and that'll just get a hold of a trigger from the brainstem level. Breathing exercises are really important. And, you know, when we're having a feeling flashback, those grounding activities like notice 5 things, smell 3 things. Again, you can put that in your box, things that cue you to activate your sensory awareness, and that encourages here and now capacity when your limbic system is really queued up and firing circuits of memories from the past that haven't settled down. So you can put things in your box like essential oils and gum and nice things to touch, and that can be a way of having some coping skills in there that address kind of the limbic system, and then the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain. Sometimes it's hard to access mindfulness practices in that state, but you can start to describe your surroundings. And just the use of language, like the trees are green, there's a small wind blowing, I hear a bus in the background, I see a bird taking flight in the sky, it looks like a raven. Using words instead of just kind of telling yourself to be mindful because you've heard McMindfulness everywhere on TikTok. That starts to cue language, and language activates the prefrontal cortex. And again, these are things that can go in a little box that you can grab to remind you when you're in a triggered state. And there's other things we can put in that box, but we only have so much time in this video. But the core point, when we notice we're in a triggered state, when we notice we are slipping into black and white thinking, coming back to baseline starts to bring color back into our lives, and it's a key component of healing trauma and having a baseline of a regulated nervous system to incorporate and integrate traumatic memories moving forward. And we like color because this is our therapy. So at this point, please take a nice pause, rest, relax. That's plenty of information. Play it back slowly. If you're following along in the workbook, please check out the workbook and be gentle with yourself. Slower is faster. Okay, so welcome back from the break. Hope you took a good long moment to process that. We're going to continue on to learn about how the nervous system helps defend us against threats. So this is a picture of the arc of the nervous system. When we're in danger, our autonomic nervous system offers us two options: do something or don't move. We have two different branches of the nervous system. There's actually more, but this is a simplified model. So these two main branches are called the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And when the amygdala perceives danger, it initiates an emergency stress response that activates the sympathetic nervous system, triggering a release of adrenaline into the body. Our heart rate and breathing increases to maximize oxygen flow, help us feel energized, powerful, and ready for action. Instinctively, the brain and body react. We run, we start to fight, we duck or hide, we scream for help, or we kick and bite. And as we are fighting or fleeing from the perceived danger, the parasympathetic system is activated by other neurochemicals that prepare the body to submit if necessary, or to recover if we have successfully defended ourselves. Suddenly, the impulse to take action stops, and we feel tired, trembly, scared, overwhelmed, nauseous, and depleted. The body can start to shake as it suddenly breaks to a stop. We feel too tired to move. In this state, it's easy to submit, or if we've been victorious, we can rest and begin to recover. In those who were regularly overpowered and had to submit, this state can persist for years. So the question is, do you recognize any of these states? It's pretty common for trauma survivors to get stuck in chronic fight or flight, while others get stuck in chronic shutdown or parasympathetic responses. And it's not uncommon to blame oneself for these reactions, not knowing that they're physical states. They're actually physiological states, not psychological reactions. Sometimes people experience both, and they alternate between sympathetic or parasympathetic responses. One minute you can feel angry, and the next minute we can feel hopeless and depressed. Or you may feel anxious or sad, and then suddenly numb and shut down. In chronic sympathetic states, it's hard to sleep, hard to slow down enough to eat or to connect with others. There's a loss of appetite, loss of sex drive, and no awareness of hunger or thirst. In chronic parasympathetic states, individuals struggle with oversleeping, overeating, low energy, diarrhea, or nausea. And this is just to talk through. Trauma is physiological. It's a body-mind with emphasis on the body state. So be gentle with yourself. Be gentle with your body. All right, so after trauma, the nervous system remains mobilized for danger. Some individuals survive thanks to heightened sympathetic activation that maintains a state of high arousal and readiness for action, while others survive by being in a chronic parasympathetic activation, which helps them lay low, hide, avoid being noticed, and sustain compliance. Good strategies when you can't escape a predator. Some alternate between the two systems when they're triggered by different cues. This can help explain why, in instances of sexual assault, people ask themselves, why didn't I do something? And, well, your nervous system chose to keep you safe by kind of plunging you into playing dead in that moment. And you couldn't act. You couldn't recruit resources to do anything in that moment because your reflexes were keeping yourself safe. Even people with well-regulated nervous systems can sometimes rely on these survival responses, so using them isn't a sign of failure at all. The window of tolerance is the band in the middle. This is when we can think and feel at the same time and tolerate our feelings and adapt our reactions to fit the situation. The window of tolerance here, it describes our emotional bandwidth. Are we able to tolerate intense feelings like of anger or grief without overreacting or acting out? Can we tolerate sadness, shame, or feeling down without becoming depressed? A wide window of tolerance is usually developed as a result of safe, secure attachment to safe people, while trauma is associated with a much smaller window. And re-traumatization can make it shrink. It's part of the harm of re-traumatization. When we are in the window of tolerance, the prefrontal cortex remains online under stress, but in states of hyper or hypoarousal, the prefrontal cortex is inhibited, noticing our nervous system's activation stimulates the prefrontal cortex to come online and helps us make sense of these survival responses. Without this awareness, we misinterpret hypoarousal as depression and hopelessness, or we are driven to impulsive actions by sympathetic activation. So tolerating our feelings and impulses requires a wide, resilient window of tolerance, and this can be trained. Seeing emotions in terms of this way can help us gauge how dysregulated we are in any moment. And we can also use that as a lens to understand some of our baffling feelings, like anxiety and anger. They're activated emotions, so they can live closer to the side of hyperarousal, whereas shame and depression are on the side of hypoarousal. And this also helps us understand suicidality. So suicidality is like it's like the 911 of the body and mind. When things are so painful and we just can't tolerate it and we don't have the resources to cope, the mind starts looking for an exit strategy. Like it's a flight, it's a way of escaping the moment. And when somebody is in a suicidal state, it might just be a way of coping. But also, like coming from a first responder background, suicidality can be aggression pointed inward, and it can also turn outward. So in high states of like conflict and domestic violence, for instance, I know when I hear a partner threatening self-harm, it can really quickly turn to violence. So it has primed me in the past to respond more quickly and effectively to gauge the danger of a situation. So anyway, it's window of tolerance is a very useful concept. So we'll develop some of these ideas more in the second video, but on the left is just a drawing saying like, in terms of hyperarousal and hypoarousal, often what comes up must go down. So it's not uncommon to feel big crashes after feeling kind of overstimulated. And in the bottom right of that little drawing on the left, forgive the stick figure, but this is how the body communicates with us. So our conscious mind is where we experience most of reality. So there's like 4 channels of communication going down and only 2 going back up. So it's really a skill to start to notice some of the physical signs of when you're feeling kind of in an overactivated state, and also the physical signs of feeling when you're in an underactivated state, and starting to move early, just to kind of keep ourselves in balance. And on the right hand side, again, more fodder for the second video, but it's important to introduce this now. There's really 6 states that people, our nervous states, exist in. So on the left hand side, these are the states kind of as we're ebbing and flowing within a window of tolerance. This is what the states of a nervous system that aren't in distress. So our baseline state is social connection. We're social beings. We, as little babies, come into the world waiting to connect, to be cared for, to exist, sometimes interacting, sometimes alone, but fundamentally centered in that way. And when we're activated, it feels like getting excited about a project or getting ready to play. And when we kind of have a down cycle in our energy within our window of tolerance, it's the state of starting to get sleepy or being ready for intimacy. And in the right hand side, these are kind of the cycles, the states of the nervous system of in distress. So that social connection and human interaction turns into people pleasing or fawning, and that can be caretaking, overwork, martyrdom, and when we are activated, it feels like fight or flight. So sometimes anxiety can feel like being frozen and having our thoughts spin really, really fast, and that's a type of shutdown. So that's like, you can think of it like a ceiling fan that stays in place and is spinning really quickly. And then when we have a down cycle in a distressed nervous system, it's really like shutting down and disconnecting completely. And that freeze is like getting in, can't get out of bed, can't move, can't feel anything. So yeah, more to come in video 2, but introducing that concept now. And here's where art comes in. So art, when you're looking at how to stay in sync, how to stay regulated, art is very soothing. So these repetitive, rhythmic actions, really calming for the nervous system. Arts and crafts from around the world have a really calming and soothing quality to them, like embroidery, mandalas. On the left, you have the technique of neurographic art. On the right, you have the technique of echo drawing, so drawing a line and just echoing it over and over and over. And mandalas have been part of systems of prayer and meditation for millennia in the Eastern world. So those are fun things to explore. Also, in terms of art and regulation, art can be a really good instrument for conscious containment of some of those big emotions or those big states. So in the center, just the act of putting a border around a painting that we do to express a certain state can help us feel more in control, or drawing out boundaries like the castle with the moat, making, expressing something within a box. Like there on the left, you can see a Zen tangle. Zen tangles are another really great, soothing, repetitive pattern drawing that helps us contain these states. And I put the little guy paddling on a kayak it's good to know that we can coexist with these states in our mind. That he's paddling across a deep cove and he can see kind of the depth of those big emotional processes, but he's just paddling along, continuing getting to the other side of the cove. He's coexisting with them as opposed to being overpowering with them. They're there, but he's skating along, and that's not escapism. It's balance and containment and awareness that are there. And lastly, emotional regulation is a really big buzzword right now, but something that's unique about art therapy is that art is part of emotional transformation, not just regulation. So these are some pieces that I did about my experience in being a Northern nurse. That's all of my journal entries from 5 years of Northern nursing turned into a collage, took over my whole back bedroom, and told a story and tried to make that useful to other people. So that's ways to transform those feelings into a work of art and into something that's beautiful. And that's a practice as old as time. Humans, we are driven by beauty, we respond to beauty, we are moved by story, and art therapy helps us access those core instincts that are really beautiful in us also. Whatever you choose on your journey in terms of art as an instrument for peacemaking and seeking peace within ourselves, it will always awaken you to the presence of your innate healing instinct. If you love doing Zen tangles or mandalas, or will join me in my love of 12-foot long collage projects, art is really a good access point to really the healing force within you and the calming force within you. And we'll talk more about that. So take a break, get some water, leave for a couple weeks. If you're following along in the Living Legacy of Trauma workbook, go ahead and pick that up and just internalize some of that information and maybe try Googling some of the calming, repetitive art activities suggested, and I will see you soon. Okay, so it's super common to stabilize trauma through unsafe and addictive behavior, and there's a lot to say here, but the common result of a chronically dysregulated nervous system is the use of drugs, alcohol, eating disorders, or self-harm to provide that false window of tolerance. When we're engaging in these behaviors, you can feel temporarily okay until the drug or chemical wears off. Sobriety or behavioral abstinence eliminates this problem but causes another. Without a resilient window of tolerance, traumatized individuals are at a high risk for relapse once they are sober and committed to safety. And these behaviors, they just help us feel normal, really. It's a nervous system that's reaching for that sense of normalcy. This diagram describes the challenge that awaits once sobriety or abstinence has been achieved. Without the chemical support, traumatized people begin to develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder within a few weeks or months, often without awareness that the reactions are trauma-related. As we become more labile, reactive, irritable, vulnerable, or flooded, impulses to relapse into self-destructive behavior are heightened. And any relapse has to be understood as a desperate attempt to regulate what feels unbearable. This isn't a moral issue. This isn't a self-control issue. This is a nervous system trying to feel okay. So part of healing is understanding the abstinence relapse cycle and going through this wheel and trying to kind of put together what are your specific symptoms for where you're at. There might not be a conscious connection between symptoms like irritability, reactivity, feeling more vulnerable, or difficulty sleeping and the trauma, but that's part of our work, is interpreting these symptoms as implicit trauma responses. Remember, we talked about body memories. Pre-relapse behavior can also be very subtle. Instead of having impulses to drink or use drugs or self-harm, you might express feeling resentful or exhausted or burned out or deserving of something pleasurable. And when relapse occurs, which it often does. It's part of the cycle. It's a learning opportunity. It's a learning opportunity to go back and learn what are the early learning signs, warning signs that we missed. Um, what is the lesson of this relapse that might prevent the next one? And something that we might not know is that, you know, addiction can happen later in life, but dealing with dysregulated environments that are traumatizing early in life, kids have to use their own resources to regulate. So babies can dissociate or go limp to go into that kind of shut down parasympathetic state. And then toddlers and preschoolers, they start to have a couple more options. And, it's very common for kids to use food to soothe themselves. Um, that's like the first external regulating things that people often have access to. So disordered eating is pretty common. Teenagers, as they get more freedom, like they can stimulate adrenaline production through hyperactive or risky behavior. These are like ADHD symptoms, and these are kind of using the internal drugstore to regulate and create a window of tolerance way before alcohol and drugs or other, whatever behavior addiction is even available or accessible. And it's all pretty desperate efforts to just regulate the nervous system. Um, and one of the things that happens with time is that the body has an increasing tolerance. So the body needs more and more of a behavior to create a window of tolerance. And compulsive behaviors have a drug effect that wears off after a few minutes, causing an urgency to repeat that behavior to stave off that kind of those PTSD symptoms, right? It starts to be it's an addictive loop. So we'll pause there. That's a lot of information to take in, but the workbook goes through that really nicely and slowly, and it's very helpful. So I'll leave you with that, with a strong encouragement to look at the workbook. So enough said. Take a pause, take a break, take that in slowly, listen to it slowly. I'm talking fast so that this presentation doesn't get too long. But you can pause and work it out. Okay, see you in a minute. Okay, so this slide helps us become aware of getting help within our own minds for dealing with trauma. So for over a century, therapists have been helping clients increase insight, to connect suffering to early childhood experiences, or to make sense of themselves in the light of the past. We have asked people to talk about their feelings as a way to connect to themselves emotionally, and all of these activities are governed by parts of the brain involved in working memory. Working memory is a short-term memory function that allows us to connect the past and present and make sense of our emotions and transform our perspective. However, when we're working with trauma, working memory structures of the brain have no direct connection to the amygdala and cannot change trauma-related reactivity. Therefore, insight helps with many things, but not with resolving trauma at the body-brain level. The one part of the brain that we can get help from that can be an asset in the treatment of trauma is the medial prefrontal cortex, or noticing brain, which is an area associated with mindful awareness and integrated activity. Increased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex has the reciprocal effect of decreasing activity in the amygdala, the fire alarm of the brain, thereby retaining it to be less reactive. All this requires of us is to learn to observe or notice instead of reacting to or interpreting what happens. Noticing a feeling as a feeling, noticing a thought as a thought, noticing an increased heart rate or tension or shaking as just a sensation can all contribute to a calmer, less reactive amygdala. It's kind of like your secret weapon, and it can really help the tendency to negatively interpret thoughts and feelings or to attack yourself all of those things reinscribe the impact of cortisol on the brain. Um, and it's helpful to start now that kind of you have some knowledge and awareness of implicit memory and body feelings and how those are trauma symptoms. It can really help to start to notice implicit responses as opposed to recall traumatic events. Recalling traumatic events can be re-traumatizing, but there's ways to, if you wish to disclose, um, to notice the thoughts and feelings that are coming up in the body. And remember, nothing therapeutic is happening in the room if you can't feel yourself breathing and if you can't feel your feet on the floor. So this is a good slide to remember, and also to remember, like, sometimes we can get stuck in a loop of telling a story and thinking that that's going to help, but that's actually the working memory going into overdrive, when what's really going to help us most is the noticing part of the brain. Okay, so there's a bunch of worksheets related to this in the workbook if you're going along, but the one that I'd like you to pay attention to is the 10% solutions page. So one of the things that's ingenious about the traumatized brain is all of these things, addictive tendencies, suicidal impulses, they have a way of automatically eliminating struggles with the window of tolerance, right? So like they're really problematic behaviors. They don't help us in life, but they do solve the problem that we have with having a tiny window of tolerance. So part of healing and recovery is that we have to start to collect little 10% solutions, along the way. So helping, it might alleviate 10% of a certain kind of feeling or thought or situation or impulse, but you start to collect enough of those and you start to get somewhere, and you don't need to reach for the same behavior or the same impulse in the same way, because things are moving and things are shifting, and this starts to give you, again, greater sense of control and greater sense of empowerment. So just wanted to highlight that worksheet because it's an important one. Okay, so this is an important concept. There's a lot more to learn here than what we're going to get through in the next couple minutes, but trauma causes disorganized attachment, making us always question, is it safe to be attached? 40 years of attachment research has established the existence of a connection between childhood mistreatment or neglect and disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment behavior is very distinctive. Young children experience the strong proximity-seeking impulses that most children do, because kids can't survive unless they're attached to a caregiver. But as they get close to their caregiver, they experience equally strong impulses to flee, fight, or dissociate. And experts in the attachment field believe that this pattern reflects biologically born instinctive drives to seek the attachment figure when frightened or alarmed, coupled with the fear of the abusive caregiver, which activates instinctive survival responses of fight, flight, or shutdown. The experience of the child, and later continued into adulthood, is one of internal struggle or emotional tug-of-war. Closeness feels dangerous, but so does separation or aloneness. This diagram depicts the lessons of secure attachment versus traumatic attachment. So therapists begin asking clients, did your caregiver create a sense of safety or danger? Do any of these reactions feel familiar to you? Were any of the caregivers ever frightening? How do these reactions play out now? And I want to underscore also that this slide emphasizes danger, but also neglect. Children, like, not having their needs met consistently also induce this cycle, like kind of the more like physical abuse kind of gets more airtime than that, but neglect also instills the same cycle. So safe attachment is crucial for children to feel safe in the world and safe with other people. And if you struggle with mistrust, it might be related to the experience of traumatic attachment more than to discrete traumatic events. It is normal to experience internal struggles about closeness after growing up in an abusive and unsafe world. It is normal for traumatized individuals to panic when there is separation from others, but also feel fear or anger when the relationship grows closer. Fear of separation is likely to alternate with anger and mistrust as closeness increases. And this is true even in the therapeutic relationship. And it can be helpful to unpack that as it happens and just sort of treat it as an experiment and kind of use it as a little laboratory to see what might be happening in the outside world. And awareness of these patterns is really helpful. And it's helpful to understand that relational difficulties arise because it's because of being triggered in relationships with others. So using the noticing brain again to decrease the intensity of responses and observe or even anticipate triggers is also really helpful here. So how we attach as adults to people is often a memory of how we attached when we were small. So immature nervous systems can be frightened by dysregulated adults or loud voices or anger or anxiety, and a parent that is frightened or frightening can't regulate a child's nervous system. And parents are supposed to be the first ones that regulate a child's nervous system. So if you grew up with domestic violence, for instance, the abused partner could not soothe or teach those skills or imbue that sense of calm and ability to self-soothe. Also in these environments, children, there's no safe place in traumatic environments. Closeness is really safe, but neither is being alone because the child is unprotected when no safe adult is present. Showing emotion is rarely safe because a child's sadness or anger often triggers an abusive or neglectful parent to lash out. Needs are not safe because normal needs for care and closeness can be exploited. It's not safe to trust reassurance, and it's certainly not safe to allow abusive parents to comfort us. It's not safe when abusive parents show affection either, nor is it safe to demonstrate loving feelings for them. Every single aspect of the kind of close relationships that we're wired for become dangerous in a traumatic environment. So again, we can name these relational patterns in adulthood, and we can see this is kind of the classic, the avoidant, the runner and the avoidant dance in an adult attachment. We can see like these are two adults that are trying to navigate the sense of traumatic attachment of being too anxious when they're alone and really being really anxious and flooded when someone gets too close, right? And a couple who's caught in this cycle, what's really helpful is to name what traumatic attachment is doing between them, because otherwise the conversation is about, from the anxious person is that you're not emotionally available for me, and from the avoidant person is, why can't you just be calm and not flood my nervous system, when there's a baseline anxious element that they're trying to juggle between them. There's that baseline, anxiety about closeness and anxiety about distance that's getting worked out. And naming that pattern and being on the same team about how to work with that pattern is really vital. And again, on the left side, if you can zoom in and see it, this is about dysregulation between people. So when somebody is stuck in fight or flight, that can turn into different forms of abuse, and that triggers somebody to go into a hypoactive state that is just submit and hide and tolerate that environment. And it's helpful to frame that instead of in victim and victimizer, because we all know that life is way more complicated than that, to start to look at things in terms of people in dysregulated states and coming together in ways that potentiate and propagate further dysregulation and how those patterns fit together. And you can look at, staying in the healthy middle, which is on the slide on the left-hand side. So it takes a lot of practice and patience to change our habits of surviving. And insight is not enough to create lasting change, but hopefully some of these slides kind of give a flavor of what those habits might be, because they can be totally unconscious. And we talked a little bit about how that can show up in intimate attachments previously, but also one thing that's different about complex trauma and attachment trauma is when we grow up around it, we can have survival traits that get ingrained into our personalities. So, flight, a common pattern for somebody who has a flight response is being a workaholic, and you can escape through just kind of compulsive action and a lot of perfectionism. Like, you have to be, the feeling of having to be perfect to connect. You can look at the freeze response. That's just somebody who might avoid human contact altogether and withdraw. Couch potato. These are things that are worth exploring just to become aware of, just to start to question some of our automatic responses of, well, do I want to be doing that? Is that really the autopilot that I want to be on? And to challenge that. And again, sometimes it's helpful to know that is those are indicative of complex trauma. And one of the main difference between PTSD and complex PTSD, besides struggles with dysregulation, is really a disconnect between how people may see us from the outside world as, loving, lovable people, members of our community, to just like this core negative self-concept that comes from internalizing those environments that we grew up in. So just knowing that you're not alone in that, knowing that if things like this can be written and published and distributed to a mass audience, this is pretty common, actually, and a lot of people have found their way through it. So it's really a source of hope. And bringing back to art therapy, so this is making some of these things conscious, whatever is true for us in these patterns, and whatever is more true for us in terms of how we may want to move through the world. That kind of non-directive process art is really great for making that visible, getting to know parts of ourselves outside of those ingrained survival responses, and also helping us metabolize early experiences now that we're in a safe, stable, and grounded environment. And in the non-directive style, you really lead with the image. The art therapist helps draw it out. And at the end of the process, you have an opportunity to hang that piece of art on the wall, step back, and really see it. And at that moment, something really magical happens in that you realize that that pattern or that self-defeating, whatever it may be, is not you. It's separate from you. You're not fused with it, and you can see the bigger picture. And having that moment to be witnessed in a safe space, it creates safe distance from traumatic memories, and it helps connect the mind, the heart, and the body holistically at your own pace and in a way that's meaningful to you. And in that space, I really love this quote, "Tell me what you fear and I will tell you what happened to you." The specific things that we fear today often act as a map charting exactly where we once felt unsafe, powerless, or overwhelmed. and exploring why we are afraid, we can identify and begin to heal some of those historic experiences that shaped our worldview so they don't have to have so much power over us anymore. Okay, that is plenty. Go ahead and take a break. There is a lot on traumatic attachment in the workbook that's very helpful. So take some time with it, make some art, make little dots on a page until a picture emerges, listen to a nice piece of music, do something restorative, and I'll see you back in a few weeks, minutes, hours. Go at your own pace. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to talk a little bit about dissociation, and dissociation is not just a symptom, it's a mental ability that's instinctively engaged during high demand situations or that occurs when our attention becomes unfocused. The dissociative continuum on this diagram attempts to depict the wide range of dissociative responses, ranging from normal, healthy, to severe or problematic. At the far left is the normal range. For example, when individuals daydream or get lost in thought or have highway hypnosis on a long road trip and find themselves at their destination without remembering the drive. We've all been there. And dissociation also aids in peak performance. It allows athletes, musicians, actors, and speakers to continue to perform while suffering from an illness or injury, mourning a loss, or experiencing performance anxiety. Medical professionals and first responders also rely on dissociative abilities to act swiftly under high-stress conditions and have rapid access to information without the distraction of their own emotional responses. If you are a first responder, there are ways to work well with this in terms of we know that we have to leave the body momentarily to do what needs to be done, but we also have to come back, come home, debrief with a colleague, clear the experience, and know that we have to deal with our emotions later so that we don't accumulate harm from our workplaces. This is a skill to develop. And then moving further down the continuum is the dissociation that occurs after a traumatic event, when individuals often have acute stress responses with intrusive images, heightened bodily reactions, and an exaggerated startled reflex. When this pattern becomes chronic, we diagnose PTSD. In PTSD, there are distinct sets of symptoms reflecting dissociative compartmentalization. Number one is numbing symptoms and instinctive avoidance of the trauma, which alternates with intrusive images, emotions, and body responses. As the compartmentalized increases and symptoms become more severe, we diagnose borderline personality disorder, dissociative disorders not otherwise specified, or dissociative identity disorders. The purpose of this diagram is to normalize this, because these diagnoses, what they really are, it's a nervous system that's experienced trauma and has found different ways to cope with it. So this dissociation can be stigmatized, but it's a skill. It's something that many people use. And it comes from, again, like children have to depend on their brains and bodies to manage overwhelming reactions provoked in a threatening world. And kids sometimes, they can go limp, go numb, and disconnect from their bodies as a way to just tolerate day to day those kind of environments. So we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. So we're going to look at one of the places where we experience that kind of cutting off in the left brain and the right brain. So we experience the world differently from each side of the brain. This is a real simplified brain model, but we're not going to talk about neuroanatomy. The right hemisphere is the nonverbal area of the brain. It expresses itself without words and in emotional and physical reactions. It's the creative area of the brain, and it's also associated with survival responses. Young kids are right brain dominant. They have strong feelings and impulses. Anybody who's hung out with a preschooler, they are a wonderful blend of irrational thought, joy, and playful creative energy. In contrast, the left brain is associated with the capacity for verbal language, conceptual thought, and good judgment. The left hemisphere grows slowly over the course of childhood as children learn to speak and eventually go to school, and it does not fully develop until children are around age 11 or 12. As a result, we often see children who are governed by their emotions at times, but then become verbal, insightful, and analytical when they are calm. These two hemispheres communicate with each other via a long, narrow structure between them known as the corpus callosum. Therefore, the ability to feel emotions, verbally articulate them, and manage autonomic dysregulation cannot develop until the corpus callosum is fully developed. It is for this reason that the two hemispheres operate relatively independently of each other before age 12. Research has also established that the brains of traumatized children and teens have a less well-developed corpus callosum, suggesting that they remain more compartmentalized than non-traumatized children. So the result of this is when that corpus callosum doesn't really develop, it's already a challenge for many people to think and feel at the same time. That's a hallmark of being within your window of tolerance. And when there is trauma on board, it can almost be a little bit like having two personalities, one very logical, rational, and verbal, but not in touch with emotion, and the other very emotional and reactive, but not accessible to reason because it doesn't have words. So this is a normal experience. It's, feeling like, oh, I'm in one side of my brain, I feel like a different person than when I'm in the other side. This can be normal, and trauma is fragmenting, and we'll talk a little bit more about. We've talked about the fragmentation of memory. Sometimes people can't remember things in words. Stories come in bits and pieces until it's processed and it comes together. But this is the fragmentation of the psyche that happens that can be reconciled and integrated with good attention and work. And here is coming back to art therapy. So these are just different modalities of integrating feeling and thinking. Sometimes people are a little bit more left brain dominant, and words are what is most accessible. Logic is what's most accessible. And poetry can be a wonderful access point to kind of connecting with the world of emotion and letting that flourish. So the middle image we'll explain in the second video, but that's the river of life that happens in a regulated state, and that's where we can think and feel at the same time. And even if that's not a common experience for us, art making gets us there automatically because it's a regulating activity. So learning to turn inward can be pretty intimidating in moving forward from trauma, but this is one of the things that we need to learn to do. Emotional regulation gets all the press, but also keying into dissociation, noticing when it's happening, noticing some of the internal cues that we get before we do it, is part of getting a greater, richer emotional vocabulary and greater self-awareness. Just keying up that little image on the right-hand side of what goes up must come down, looking at 4 channels coming down from the mind, 2 channels of communication coming up from the body. We really need to start paying attention to those 2 channels and checking in as opposed to checking out. When we grew up in environments with a lot of emotional poverty, a lack of attunement, adults might be dysregulated and unable to be present to check in with, what are you needing? What are you feeling? Are you sad? Tell me about that. That kind of attunement to our needs and to our inner worlds is what helps us develop the ability to attune to ourselves, and from that, attune to other people skillfully, to their inner worlds. So we have to reclaim that space and reclaim that skill, and that's part of the early stabilization of trauma work. All right, so go ahead, get a snack, get some water, stretch, give yourself a hug, congratulate yourself on doing really well today. Check in with how you're feeling, check in with the sensations in your body, and grab that workbook if you're working on it, and I will see you in the next section. Okay, so understanding trauma-related fragmentation. So the structural dissociation model is a theory that describes how the minds of trauma survivors compartmentalize a response to chronic trauma. The theory rests on the scientific fact that the brain is composed of a number of discrete structures governing different functions that communicate via neural pathways. The author calls these fault lines for dissociation. The physically compartmentalized structure of the brain lends itself easily to psychological compartmentalization. The splitting allows for flexible responses to a dangerous environment. This diagram depicts the basic splitting that occurs with even a single incident trauma. The physical split between the right and left hemispheres and their functions becomes a psychological split that allows the left brain side of the personality to keep on keeping on as if nothing unusual has happened, while the right brain side of the personality holds the nonverbal emotional and body memories and hypervigilant anticipation of another threat. The right brain side stays on guard, while the left brain side carries on normally. Often the left brain part of the personality has no memory of what happened, while the right brain part has no access to language and can't create a narrative of the experience it now fears. This diagram is particularly applicable to clients who are unsure of what happened or mystified by the conflicts between the two polarities. So, if you've ever been told that you have PTSD or complex PTSD, BPD, DD, NOS, or DID, this diagram is normalizing and it provides a scientific approach to understanding the difficulties you may have experienced. When dissociation is presented as an automatic, instinctive mental ability that capitalizes on the split between hemispheres, it makes sense, right? Like, this is a way of coping that works when we don't have any other resources. It's important to emphasize that the going on with normal life part, it's not a false self that's simply pretending to go on. It's an instinct to keep on keeping on that's inherent in all mammals because we need to survive, and we wouldn't have survived as a species without it. So, just take a moment to appreciate the courage and adaptability of both sides equally. And this is a pretty well-known model for trauma treatment in Europe. And one thing that I want to underscore, again, because we talked about it with complex PTSD, is that there's that idea of inner shame. There's that disconnect between how people might see you and might really love, appreciate, and value you, and how you might feel on the inside. And people sometimes feel like the outside self is false, and that sense of being flawed is what is true, but that's not the case, right? So understanding, this is the beginning of kind of understanding how different parts of the self hold parts of experience, and starting to have like some appreciation and some compassion for just how well you've been able to hold it all together without getting the kind of care and nurture and attunement, um, you know, prior in your healing journey. So when many traumatic events happen, developmentally particularly, more splitting is required. As more trauma and more compartmentalization occur, parts start to develop that can mobilize instinctive defense survival responses: fight, flight, freeze, like a deer in the headlights, submit, cry for help, or attach for survival. For example, one part develops driven by the fight response, which might be characterized by an intense hypervigilance or readiness for action. Another part develops with flight responses, ready to run or distract. Another part might develop to play an alarm function by evoking fear responses that warn other parts of impending danger. Trauma keeps us in a state of always looking for what might be dangerous. Another part might develop for the purpose of automatic compliance and submission to disarm a perpetrator, that kind of freeze, shut down, shame response to hide in the face of danger that we can't escape from. Another part might develop to gain protection from other people. And um, this is because children have to depend on their instinctive animal defense survival responses in the absence of parental protection and nurture. So these sort of parts develop spontaneously as a form of self-protection. So just see if any of that might resonate for you. The system of splitting maximizes the chances of survival because it allows for multiple ways of surviving to be engaged simultaneously. For example, the submit part might caretake the abusive caregiver while the fight part remains hypervigilant, scanning for danger. The cry for help part tries to elicit support from other family members, and the flight part imagines a fantasy world where everything would be okay. These parts can get into conflict with each other, which is why they have to be picked apart and understood separately. So, the key points here, this is a theory of adaptation, not a theory of victimization or a theory of memory. These different parts are repositories of memory and promote survival. The question here as you go along in the workbook or just listen is, are any of these parts familiar to you? And be curious about them. Be curious about how they might be trying to help you survive. And be curious about how they might be problematic. What might be the most problematic? What might be the most helpful? Structural dissociation is usually found in people with complex trauma or borderline personality disorder, not just in dissociative disorders. And again, this is what a child has to do to protect themselves. This is a system that worked really well for a really long time. So have some appreciation for the ingenious nature of your own mind. It might not be working anymore, but pretty remarkable how you were able to create a window of tolerance, how you were able to protect yourself for a really long time. Like the mind is remarkable, and the mind is even more remarkable because we can become aware of this and start to grow. So we become aware, as we move forward, we start to become more aware also not only of the parts of the traumatized side of the personality, but also parts that help with the challenges of normal life. So structural dissociation model goes on to emphasize that the more splitting can occur along the lines of either hemisphere in clients with dissociative identity disorder, so-called, especially the left brain dominant subparts, often develop to support functioning in normal daily life. They also tend to represent systems or tendencies within the brain and body, such as productivity, socialization, or care for the young. Just as there are different ways of surviving, there can be different ways of just keeping on. And many clients are able to use their normal life subparts to support their functioning and enjoyment of day-to-day life, and they can feel more competent. You can look at these parts of yourself as resources. You might have a professional working part. You might have a nurturing caregiver part. You might have a social part that easily engages with others, and maybe another one that likes to hide and with a bunch of fantasy novels. It's like these are also ways of coping with going on with normal life in the face of carrying a lot of trauma. And sometimes the challenges of a harsh, dangerous environment necessitate the development of even more parts, including parts that contribute to being able to keep on going and manage life tasks and difficulties. And these often these competent specialized parts are even better in the roles than you may feel. A nurturing part can ensure that the client's child grows up with secure attachment. A professional or worker part can ensure that you're financially stable and secure. And these are resources to be appreciated. So survival is not always about sheer endurance, even though carrying a lot of trauma that can feel that way sometimes. Survival can mean that you've developed a lot of important capacities and resources just to adapt to an abnormal situations, and capacities that will really be enriching and bloom in post-traumatic growth. So, I'll just take a moment. The workbook goes on and and breaks this down really well. But, understanding some of these subparts are really critical because when these are the subparts that are running our life in kind of the survival program, um, limited benefit from traditional therapy isn't uncommon, right? Because these are defense mechanisms that can be really hard to get around. And it's not uncommon to also have some somatic symptoms like chronic pain or unusual pain tolerance or migraine headaches, or you can have an unusual need for sleep but never feel rested. Um, Memory symptoms, difficulty remembering the day, and just real subtle manifestations of fragmentation. So you can function really, really well in some parts and then have a part that will come out and just feel overwhelmed, abandoned, suicidal, or self-destructive. And those are evidence of, okay, I might have had a psyche that developed some fragmentation to cope, and I'm going to need um, some specific care and some specific attention to really understand that and really let myself heal and come together. So how do we start doing that? So we start by asking, who is showing up now? Which part? And this can be really challenging to start to notice structurally dissociated parts as they show up in thoughts, feelings, impulses, actions, and body responses. But it's a skill that can be developed, and this diagram describes the most common characteristics of each different type of part so they can be more easily recognized. And because each part is driven by a specific animal defense survival response, ancient survival responses, its manifestations will usually be consistent with its particular survival strategy. For example, the fight response is the only one associated with the capacity for aggression. So any type of violent behavior, whether towards self or other, is associated with the fight part. The submission response is the only survival response associated with hypoarousal, numbing, and hopelessness. The freeze response is associated with almost all fear reactions, including anxiety symptoms, panic attacks, and phobias. The submit part can retreat to bed in shame, depression, and hopelessness, and the hypervigilant fight part can push people away with irritability, mistrust, and guardedness. So getting to know these things, getting to know their fingerprints, it's almost like tracking. You're like tracking a critter in there. These animal instinctive responses, you can track them. Separation anxiety, rejection sensitivity, and fear of abandonment are the primary characteristics of a cry for help or attach part. That's a very young part. Addictive behavior and disordered eating are always fleeing from painful emotions and thus are indicative of the flight part. The freeze part is associated with almost all fear or anxiety reactions that might cause the normal life part to feel situational anxiety that can trigger panic in the freeze part. It's a lot of information, but if you look at the 6 states of the nervous system, the 2 different freeze responses are there, and you can see where one of them is attached to different presentations of panic. Yeah, low self-esteem is the hallmark of the submit part. Depression, shame, and hopelessness and helplessness. The submit and flight part often express suicidal ideation or longing, but only the fight part has the aggressive capacity to cause injury to the body. Self-harm, self-loathing, mistrust, and hypervigilance are also qualities of the fight part. So tracking these things in the self, being aware of them, hunting them, in the psyche, understanding them, and also appreciating them for helping you survive. That's all part of the journey. And all of these parts within the psyche, they're like inner parentified children that are trying to manage things that they should have never had to manage in the first place, but they keep going. So learning, assuming that intense and intrusive emotions, thoughts, and impulses are communication from these parts, is step one, and practice differentiating your going on with normal life self from your traumatized part. We all have an adult self, no matter how depleted, demoralized, or unable to function we may feel on our worst days. But you might not have paid attention to this part because the parts can be so distracting. But you can start to notice when you feel small and overwhelmed. You can start to notice when your reactions are driven by fear, and you can start to speak the language of these parts to interpret your symptoms instead of just fusing with them and enacting them. And there's the process in healing that we call differentiation, which is becoming ourselves. And these internal parentified children kind of hold us back from becoming ourselves, much in the same way that dysfunctional families cast people into roles to kind of serve and stabilize the dysfunctional system. And we start to understand and empathize with our internal worlds and the roles that they're trying to fulfill to keep us safe. And we also start to kind of outgrow family roles that we might have been cast into earlier in life as we grow and feel safe and feel like we have more possibilities and choice in our outer world. And there's more and more research about art therapy in the broader world. So I just kind of leave this. These are some examples of mask art of veterans that have embraced that concept and started exploring and unifying their fragmented selves from TBI and PTSD. Kind of in understanding those parts as masks that they periodically put on and can take off. And that little quote, every creative knows that their work has a symbiotic effect. As they create, they themselves are created. Okay, we're getting close to being done, but go ahead and pause, take care of yourself, look up how to do a butterfly hug, do some soothing art, try echo art. It's easy and it's a crowd pleaser. Get your Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma workout if you're working on it. And just kind of let some of that information sink in and integrate and simmer. Peace. So, cultivating a wise self. Good news is we already have a wise self. It can't be broken. It's always there. It's curious, compassionate, calm, clear, creative, courageous, confident, and connected. It's never damaged. You don't have to develop it. It's there. You will find it. Art will always lead you to that. That I have faith in as much as I have faith that the sun will rise tomorrow. So this is a concept from Internal Family Systems, and it helps stabilize structurally dissociated clients by stimulating prefrontal activity. So these are the 8 C qualities. They can't be damaged or destroyed, no matter how severe the trauma. And we call that an IFS, the self. Some people term that the higher self or the wise self. For some people, this is really an access point to deeper levels of spirituality and spiritual understanding in themselves. So the IFS system of parts is labeled differently in a more general way rather than in a trauma-informed language of structural dissociation, but it's the same idea. IFS adds the idea of psychological defenses represented by different parts, from parts who adapt and conform to the abusive environment, known as managers, to parts who create crisis and chaos, firefighters, to deflect attention from the most wounded and vulnerable parts of ourselves, which are exiled. Whichever parts model is used, the concept of building on the 8 C qualities, increasing self-energy, and emphasizing inner healing are very helpful in the treatment of fragmentation. So you might automatically deny being curious or compassionate, but I challenge you to look more deeply. Have you ever felt for 10 seconds a speck of curiosity? Have you ever felt compassion for a pet or a child or an older person? Spending more time in this part of ourselves helps us see that that aspect of ourselves holds all of the fragmentation, holds all of the parts. That is our adult self. Every human being embodies those qualities uniquely and beautifully, just as, you will only exist once in the world. No one has ever existed like you, and you are one of a kind in the expression of that energy. So choose a C quality that you want to develop more and consciously and deliberately choose to expand it. Curiosity and clarity are two of the easiest choices to make for trauma survivors. Compassion, calm, and confidence are often very difficult ones. Again, internalization of shame. So, next slide. Okay, so here's the trauma-informed stabilization treatment model. This is a trauma-focused parts approach that integrates concepts and techniques from structural dissociation theory, IFS, sensory motor psychotherapy, and clinical hypnosis. TIST also focuses on internal healing rather than healing through relationships. The therapeutic relationship supports internal healing and facilitates it by providing a curious, compassionate, calm, and accepting environment. As shown in the diagram, the going on with normal self part is asked to be curious and interested in all parts, to appreciate the role in surviving, and to notice there's still unresolved fears and worries. As you use the C qualities to become more aware of your parts, and develop more empathy towards them, the parts begin to feel a sense that someone is there, someone's safe and strong, and we heal some of those attachment wounds internally. So all sides are encouraged to develop more trust and communication, and your going on with normal life part is charged with this responsibility to take parts under your wing. And, I ask you to take care of those parts. Well, not to take care of them because that's triggering language, if you have a history of being parentified, but taking them under your wing is kind of a gentle term, and it kind of gives that image of the curious, compassionate, calm, clear, creative, courageous, confident, connected parts of yourself just coming up and holding you. The job of the normal life self is to recognize the struggles of the parts as their struggles, and to mindfully notice them rather than be driven by them, rather than to be fused with them, hijacked even. The parts need to be offered curiosity, kindness, empathy, compassion, perspective, calm, courage, and confidence until their trust and confidence in the normal life part grows and attachment bonds form. So as we move forward in trauma healing, we're less riveted on the past by survival responses, and we're more able to stay in the present moment, calm and focused and engage with people around us. And we have less secrets that we're keeping from ourselves about how we had to survive, what we had to do. And trauma-related dynamics in couples can come up for healing also, because we bring wounded young parts of ourselves into couple relationships that can cause conflict. So traumatized couples often also need to understand the dynamics of trauma. People with traumatic attachment can often wind up together. So it's helpful to review some of the earlier slides. But we validate the relationship. Once upon a time, you might be in a couple where the two of you fell in love and decided to make a life together, a life that would be very different from the life you lived as children. But what you didn't know is that you would each bring with you a young child self and a teenage protector, and then suddenly the two of you were fighting, and you didn't know why, because you didn't know about disorganized attachment or the window of tolerance. So it can be helpful to think of a recent fight that you may have had with your partner and ask what triggered the fight. And assume that the reaction to a trigger is usually the response of a young, wounded child part, followed by the reaction of a teenage protector. We can break these ideas down more outside of this video, but bear with me, and go through step by step in a structured way to avoid reactivating the argument, and help couples identify parts of themselves that get activated in those triggering doom cycles, like when you were late, your partner's child part got triggered and felt hurt and abandoned. Okay, when that child part felt hurt and abandoned, how did the teenage protector react? Interesting. So the teenage protector stopped speaking to you. And what part got triggered when the teenage protector put up a wall? Okay, and the young part of you rejected and shut out. And how did your teenage protector respond? And on and on. So you identify where the trigger is, what the problematic behaviors are, and suddenly you have a lot more understanding of each other, and then some of the deeper parts of yourself can also relate. So breaking down conflicts that we have in intimate relationships part by part, and just explaining that you too wouldn't behave this way if you were in your wise adult minds, but fights will happen when wounded and protector parts are triggered, and that encourages mindfulness and curiosity about the parts, and also compassion for them, rather than arguments that exacerbate the tension. And this too is part of disentangling fragmentation. And as we do this, we find that we heal, our relationships heal, our healing within ourselves becomes deeper, because the absence of self-regulation can be tied to an early lack of co-regulation. When we become calm together, when we understand and are nurtured and have that feedback cycle of being attuned to and feeling understood and seen. So we co-regulate to self-regulate, and then our self-regulation leads to more co-regulation with partners. It's not perfect. We have to make repairs, but that starts to build up the magic of trust and commitment and calm that make for a good relationship. And there's more that we can understand in building not just good romantic relationships, but also good friendships, good, solid, nurturing friendships. Plug for The Science of Love by John Gottman. This is kind of the master of someone who really studied how humans relate in loving ways and relating in ways that work. Highly recommend checking that out if you want to go deeper in your friendships, if you want to have more intimacy in your partnership as your own healing process continues. Good stuff right there. And as we said in the beginning of this presentation, trauma is really the state of disconnection of self, other, and spirit. And art is a wonderful way to practice reconnecting in community. On the left, they've done studies. People who regularly attend cultural events live longer and age more slowly. And, group creative activities can be a wonderful way to exist with a regulated nervous system around other regulated people and practice feeling safe. We'll talk more about this in the second video, but that can feel pretty vulnerable sometimes when you've been used to being in fight or flight mode. So finding safe opportunities to practice that can be really healing. And other cultures have known that for millennia and have myriad cultural traditions to support that. So something to explore. Okay, so there's more than one way to do this, but the 4 steps to freedom, it's about managing flashbacks. So because trauma responses interfere with the ability to retrieve insights and use skills during times of distress, it is helpful when we can offer a simple structured protocol that you can use and repeat over again. This protocol is adapted from Claudia Black's book, Changing Course, Healing from Loss, Abandonment, and Fear. There's another good one in the From Surviving to Thriving flashback protocol for complex childhood trauma in the resources section. But these 4 simple steps can help you recognize when you're triggered and get to a different place. So number 1, first and most important, assume that the distress you feel now has been triggered. You know about the difference between a triggered feeling and a regular feeling, and this stops us from interpreting the distress in ways that exacerbate it, such as blaming ourselves or others. The second step must be done carefully to avoid activating a flood of memories and a tsunami of emotions, but fast forward through your childhood past for 20 seconds and notice where these feelings best fit. The fast forwarding provides information without reactivating trauma responses. Third, the third step, identify the internalized old belief. Can be confusing sometimes. Any experience we have either creates or confirms a belief we hold about ourselves. So identify the internalized old belief that can be coming from trauma. Fourth step is find a way to challenge that belief. Is often accomplished simply by acknowledging the old belief, like, I'm a bad person, I'm ashamed of myself, this is my fault, for instance. Those can be automatic defect thoughts that sometimes happen so quickly we don't even hear them. And when you identify that belief, for instance, it was my fault as an old belief, you make room for the possibility of a new belief. You don't have to give up that old belief. You just have to challenge it in some meaningful way in the moment. So, key points, there's no need to find a single event or detail that accounts for the triggered response. That's not helpful. Triggered feelings are usually the result of a repeated or enduring conditions day in, day out, not single events. And trauma-related beliefs often contribute to the cycles of triggering, dysregulation, and feeling and body memories. And this protocol offers a simple way to help you become of how your beliefs reinforce PTSD. Why? Because trauma goes after our belief systems, and trauma lodges in our belief systems. And we'll talk about it more in the second video, but this is the start of untangling that. Okay, plenty of information. Pause, grab your workbook, grab your sketchbook. It's nice outside. Enjoy the great outdoors. I will see you when I'm looking at you. See you soon. All right, everyone, so we're winding down, so we're just going to go back to where we started. The phase-oriented treatment model described in this diagram has been the gold standard in trauma treatment world for decades. Once it became clear that retrieving and recounting the details of traumatic memory was often destabilizing for clients, the field began using this model to ensure that clients would not be re-traumatized by their own memories in the process of psychotherapy. This diagram helps you see where you might be in the recovery process and collaborate in treatment planning. For example, you might minimize self-harm or drinking to manage trauma-related emotions, but can see in the diagram that you're in phase 1 and need to work on unsafe behaviors before progressing. Or you might feel like, I have to talk about it, I have to tell somebody what happened, without awareness of whether or not you might be ready for that step. If going right into the traumatic story can really put a person at risk of experiencing overwhelming emotions and flooding if you don't have the stabilization work necessary to tolerate the feelings and memories in place. I know that it can be really discouraging how long trauma recovery can take, but it's really helpful to just look back at this phased diagram and see that you are moving forward, bit by bit. And remember, like, we all saw Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle, she looks like she's smiling and happy in that photo. She did not know. She had to become aware that something was wrong. She had to get out of that situation. She had to get her man on board. And look at her now. She's rocking. She, those two are the happiest in the not so royal family. Like, she got a little help from Beyonce. I might not be Beyonce, but I'd like to think that I'm helpful. Just kidding. All right. So anyway, the recovery process should not be so terribly serious. And if you're working with me, it is going to be fun and we will laugh, guaranteed. So I will close off this presentation talking about hope, talking about things that I know to be true, because you will know them also. And the first one is hold on, pain ends. That's what hope stands for. And we may not have chosen our beginnings, but we can learn to write better endings. And everything in your story belongs in the human story. You are not alone in this. This presentation wouldn't have been possible had it not been for thousands, millions of people going on that journey, sharing what they learned with one another, so that other people could be lifted up by that. And I know that in this process, you will come into contact with an innate healing force that is within you, that cannot be broken, that is as reliable as the sunrise. I have deep faith and confidence in that, and you can borrow that faith and confidence until you find that in your journey. So come as you are. You are welcome here. You belong, and thank you for the privilege of walking together. So that's it. That's all. That's been almost 2 hours. Here is a link to the flip chart that was used to create this presentation. And here are some really helpful resources that I also reference that you can reference. And again, knowledge is not the same as the relational work that it takes to move through trauma, but knowledge is power. And one of my goals is that you know everything that I know. So we will be on equal footing.